Gazelle Overshop here. Bloody says, inspired by your Trash Talk podcast with Rafi Cohen, how did Australian cricket culture towards sledging change so dramatically from the 60s and 70s? Is it because they were the first generation not to grow up with Bradman? Oh, okay. So how did they come more sledging? Australian cricket culture really had been verbal, probably after World War One. So I would say Warwick Armstrong is a huge part of it. I said before, he's really the first Australian cricket captain, as in what you think of as an Australian cricket captain, sort of a bastard, right? And tough as nails, and a bit of a dick. All those sorts of things, like, probably comes out of him. But we talked about this recently. I do think Australian cricket is played very, very differently than other nationalities' cricket. Like, just the way that it developed, and so it was probably more. If you look at the England sledging and what we know of early England sledging, it was a lot more sort of class put downs and cheeky asides and everything. Whereas I think Warwick Armstrong was quite clearly trying to get in people's heads and really fuck them up, right? In a way that probably even W.G. Grace wasn't really doing, although, there's obviously elements that he had to that as well. But he was W.G. Grace, so he didn't really think about it, whereas I think Warwick Armstrong did. There's that story of, I always forget the player, is it Frank Woolley? Where he bowls 20 minutes, maybe it's not 20 minutes, but 10 minutes, 12 minutes of warm-up deliveries on the pitch beside while Woolley's waiting to make his debut in Test cricket. That's kind of where it starts, right? And it continues to grow from there. But if you also go back, like, think about, the SCG, there's a statue of a person who was famous for abusing players, right? But they were funny, so it's okay. Like, yeah, maybe not if you were the one that was being abused, I would assume. So I think it's more in that cricket culture than anything else. And it was just slowly coming across. The Bradman teams were a little bit different at times, but there was certainly, Arthur Morris was really, really, he would play psychological tricks with bowlers. I'm missing someone else. There's someone else really obvious as well, that would get into people's heads and chirp at them. And the abuse thing really comes out more that I think the generation of the 70s, 80s was just probably, without being a sociologist, is probably the first truly Australian generation of people. I think if you listen to, the old Australians talk, there was still an element of English within them. And then, I've talked about this before, but if you look at the 70s is when the music industry explodes in Australia, and it's unlike anywhere else in the world, right? A completely different kind of, music, that sort of pub rock, AC/DC style of music. Then you have the cinema, which is also, Mad Max and, the Cars that Ate Paris and, all these random films and, like, this cross between, like, European auteurs and just, like, Hollywood trash movies, which were just bizarre. And then you have the cricket team with the shirts all unbuttoned, chewing gum. And I do think that those three things are all linked, and that Australia was becoming a full-fledged version of Australia. Whereas even if you listen in the 50s and 60s to the old newsreels, it was very much, it was an Australian trying to do an English accent kind of thing. And things just went so violently away from that. And I think the Warwick Armstrong kind of, and there were lots of other guys, he's just like one of them, but there was a lot of other guys. I think that kind of fed in and just kept going up. And then they didn't want to be English, right? Very, very clear how different the two societies were by that point. And I think there's more of an explosion of that. And New Zealand probably had it as well, but it comes out, New Zealand's, anyone who knows Australians and New Zealanders will be like, they're similar, but they're not really the same. And so I think there was a big part of that coming about. And then, cricket-wise, Australian cricket's always been a bit rougher and angrier and grittier than other places. And maybe that sort of the club side and the country, you know, suburban cricket and country cricket especially, really, really, you know, quite full on at times. I think that kind of bled into the national team rather than the other way around. Um, I was talking to an Australian great about this sort of stuff, maybe for Rafi's book or around Rafi's book. And no, I was trying to get this person to talk to Rafi about it, but you know, we were chatting about it, and I was saying that like I don't think people understand how much worse Australian club cricket was than the national team. And he's like, yeah, like even the Australian players would go back and like just would be like, what the hell is going on here? So I do think there was you know, maybe a confluence of all those things, but it certainly goes back before Bradman when it was starting. I think that's fair. I think Warwick Armstrong, even if he wasn't a sledger in the way that maybe Chappelli was or Steve Waugh was, it was kind of there and it was happening. And then as the culture of Australia changed, and because, as I said as well, because they played differently, it made sense to them to play this way.